Our first guest tonight is the youngest member of Elijah Cummings' committee. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez will share with us what it was like to take her place in the House of Representatives this year and win a valuable seat on the House Oversight Committee with Chairman Cummings as her guide, welcoming her to the work of that committee. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has changed the definition of the possible for freshman members of the House of Representatives. She has captured more public attention than any freshman member of the House of Representatives in history. And in politics, attention is power. Without the attention Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has brought to the Green New Deal, it would not be one of the leading agenda items of the Democratic Party and one of the most prominent issues debated in the presidential campaign. And without the professionalism that she has brought to her legislative agenda in the House, she would not have a Senate partner on the Green New Deal, which is absolutely mandatory for any realistic legislative enterprise. But like an old pro at legislating, the freshman congresswoman found a partner in Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts, who has pushed the Green New Deal onto the Democratic agenda in the United States Senate. There's no reason to expect leadership like that from a freshman member of the House, because we have never seen leadership like that from a freshman member of the House. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is one of the freshman members of the House who have changed what is possible in committee hearings by the sharpness and inescapable logic of their questions in the 5 minutes that they are allowed to ask them. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez did that yesterday in what became 5 of the worst minutes of Mark Zuckerberg's very rich life as the CEO of Facebook, who has gotten through most of the years of his life without ever having to answer difficult questions. We'll show you some of that video of what Mark Zuckerberg ran into yesterday when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez got her 5 minutes. But we begin tonight with impeachment. And as the luck of history would have it, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is one of the members of Congress who is participating in the impeachment investigation as a member of the House Oversight Committee. Contrary to Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz's lies as he was leading his congressional drunk driving collision with the investigating committees yesterday, there are, in fact, dozens of Republican members of the House who are also allowed to participate in and ask questions in the investigation, including in the closed-door depositions, because they are members of the investigating committees. Republican Senator Lindsey Graham is introducing a resolution in the Senate to object to the procedures being used by the House of Representatives. We will consider Lindsey Graham's objections later in this hour, when we will be joined by former federal prosecutor Joyce Vance and former Undersecretary of State Wendy Sherman. Most Republican senators are supporting Lindsey Graham's resolution objecting to the House procedures, but in what could be an ominous sign for Donald Trump, as of tonight, 8 Republican senators have chosen not to support Lindsey Graham's resolution, including Senator Mitt Romney, Senator Susan Collins, Senator Lisa Murkowski. If just half of those 8 senators were to join with Democrats in the Senate and vote against Donald Trump in his impeachment trial, then a majority of the Senate would be voting against the president, which would be an important note for history, even though the president could remain in power, because it takes 67 votes to convict and remove a president in an impeachment trial in the Senate. And joining us now is Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who represents the state of New York's 14th congressional district, which covers portions of the Bronx and Queens in New York City. Congresswoman, thank you very much for joining us tonight on this very important news night. And I want to get your reaction to what is happening in the impeachment investigation, beginning quickly with that very strange car crash of a scene we saw of Matt Gaetz leading a physical attack into the committee to disrupt it.
Yeah, Lawrence. Well, first and foremost, I remember seeing, that sea of men banging outside of House Intelligence, thinking that it was quite funny because many of them are my colleagues on the House Oversight Committee and have access to those depositions. So they were pretending that they weren't able to be in these depositions, like many members of Congress, Republican and Democrat alike, in order to create a spectacle. But the truth of the matter is it's not that. The reason they were doing that is because they knew exactly what was going on inside. They know exactly what this testimony and what these depositions are adding up to, and that, frankly, it is revealing a very disturbing sequence of events and a very likely abuse of power and breaking of our oath to the Constitution of the United States.
Now, I know you were in Ambassador Gordon Sondland's closed-door deposition there. We had Congressman Peter Welch with us the other night. And after William Taylor testified in direct contradiction of Ambassador Sondland, let's listen to what Congressman Welch said about the possibilities of perjury charges there. Let's listen to that. Is Gordon Sondland in danger of perjury charges for his testimony to your committee?
Well, I think he is. The evidence is now coming out that, in fact, he was a very active instrument to try to essentially assist Giuliani in the effort to have this rogue foreign policy. So, yes, I think Ambassador Sondland has some reason to be worried about how his testimony is going to be evaluated when reviewed by potential prosecutors.
And today, Ambassador Sondland's criminal defense lawyers relied on the do not recall defense to cover the conflict in his testimony with Ambassador Taylor's testimony. What is your sense of how much possible perjury charge danger Ambassador Sondland is in?
Well, I think a lot of what we're seeing here does reveal a decent amount of testimony that, frankly, just isn't lining up. This is exactly why in the House of Representatives we separate all of our witnesses and depose them individually and in private so that we can get these stories down and see what adds up and what doesn't. That is also a major reason why these Republicans are fighting to perhaps make all of this public. You know, it is known that this is done with the blessing of the president. And perhaps one of the reasons they're fighting for all of this testimony to be public is so that folks could potentially line up their depositions. We don't know. But with respect to Ambassador Sondland, well, you know, the fact that they're relying on this do not recall, let's see what comes out, I do not think bodes very well for him. But once again, we still have more depositions left to go, and we have to really get all of the facts.
It has been a very sad week for you and for the members of the House and the committee in particular with the loss of Chairman Cummings. What was it like for you to be, first of all, with a seat on his committee and then be welcomed onto that committee by Elijah Cummings?
Oh, it was the complete honor of a lifetime. When I first asked to be assigned to the House Oversight Committee, he brought me into his office personally and really wanted to know not just why I wanted to be on this committee, but he wanted to know who I was. And it was a real testimony to who Elijah Cummings was as a leader. He cared about serving the most vulnerable Americans, about bringing truth to light, about speaking truth to power. And unlike and contrary to the culture of Congress, which is so focused on the power of seniority, he, as Speaker Pelosi mentioned earlier this year, said, I want all the freshmen on my committee. He was a relentless coach. He was an inspired mentor, and he believed and invested time in each and every one of us. And I feel profoundly blessed to have spent the last 10 months with our chairman.
It seems at this point certain that the House of Representatives is going to deliver articles of impeachment, at least one, to the United States Senate for trial, which leaves the senators in the posture of jurors. Some of them are actually refraining from comment on the basis of being jurors. We've seen this before when the Clinton Senate jury was assembled. Some of them, it's unlike a court jury where you're not allowed to make any comment. They can decide ahead of time how they're going to vote. Some of them announce that, some of them don't. What is your sense of how the presidential candidates who are going to be jurors, there's about 5 of them now, from Senator Sanders, the candidate you've endorsed, through Elizabeth Warren, Cory Booker, Amy Klobuchar, how they should handle themselves now as the prospect of being potential jurors in the Senate trial becomes more and more serious?
Well, first and foremost, I think what's important to acknowledge is that the president has committed crimes in public. And this is something that we know. This is something that all people know from from the green of the White House. He solicited election interference and discussed election interference with respect to China. He released public notes of his calls where he solicited and engaged in using the power of his office to create a politically motivated investigation against a political opponent. So this is all out in the public. We know that he has committed a crime. The question is, how many other people are implicated in this? The question is, how often did he do it? Did he do it in other circumstances? How big does this get? And so with respect to the number of articles, I think that it's fair to say, let's look at what rolls in. But with respect to Ukraine and several other instances, it's a very open and shut case. So I think it's important that we discuss the fact that he has committed impeachable crimes. It's just a question of how many and how many people were involved and who knew.
In addition to your work in the committees and your investigative committees, you're also become very active now in the political campaign, actively campaigning for Bernie Sanders, endorsing Ed Markey for Senate in Massachusetts, and endorsing a new candidate, Attorney Cisneros, in Texas, running for the House in Texas. You're spreading your endorsements around the electoral map. How much of that is something that is distracting from your daily work in the House?
Well, I put my work in the House front and center. But what I do believe is that these endorsements are part of the work that we have to do in the House. Very frequently, someone will say, oh, we can't pass a Green New Deal. We don't have support for that. Oh, Medicare for All is, quote unquote, unfeasible because we may not have support in certain areas of the House. Well, if we want to change that, then we need to be changing the math of the House. And we need to be protecting those folks who are leading and are taking political risks in order to serve the people of the United States of America. And so my work, first and foremost, informs the other work that I do to organize the electorate. But it is important to acknowledge that in order to pass a transformative agenda for working class Americans, we got to have the numbers and we got to have the leadership in place. And so we have to play in both if we're really going to change this country and if we're serious about that.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.